Wildlife vehicle collisions cause roughly 200 human deaths and 30,000 injuries in the United States each year, costing drivers more than $8 billion annually. In America, a car strikes and kills a large animal roughly every 26 seconds. Roads create barriers to wildlife as they seek food, water, and mates, and as they attempt to adapt to our changing climate. Fortunately, proven solutions exist. Properly sited crossing structures with associated fencing along roads can reduce these collisions by up to 97%. Late last year, Congress passed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act with bipartisan support, which expanded federal funding opportunities for wildlife infrastructure, including $350 million in brand new dedicated funding for a wildlife crossing pilot program. Our organizations are working to raise stakeholder awareness about wildlife crossings, how important good data is for investing in and prioritizing crossings, and helping applicants identify potential funding opportunities within the new infrastructure law. On behalf of our organizations, we thank you for your interest in furthering this crucial work to make our nation's roadways safer for both people and wildlife.
Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Stephanie Adams, and I serve as the Associate Director of Wildlife for the National Parks Conservation Association. NPCA has teamed up with ARC Solutions, Wildlands Network, and the Center for Large Landscape Conservation to deliver this webinar series dedicated to demystifying wildlife crossing infrastructure projects. Today, we'll be discussing new and expanded funding sources for wildlife mitigation within the bipartisan infrastructure law. More than 500 state and federal DOT representatives have identified funding as the #1 barrier to deploying wildlife crossings in the U.S. Today, we're fortunate to be joined by our expert panelists, who all have diverse and valuable experience in implementing wildlife crossing infrastructure, as well as in securing diverse funding sources. Renee Callahan, the Executive Director of ARC Solutions, will kick us off with an overview of new wildlife crossing funding opportunities, with a focus on the National Discretionary Grant Program. Then, Tony Cady, a Regional Planning and Environmental Manager for Colorado Department of Transportation, will discuss state-led funding opportunities and share his insights as how to best engage in state transportation planning processes. Finally, Chris Slazar, Environmental Resource Coordinator with the Vermont Agency of Transportation, will share his experience of how a community succeeded in securing 2 transportation alternative grants, as well as some lessons learned as to how best position your project for similar success. At the conclusion of their presentation, Marta Brockie, Associate Director of ARC Solutions, will be moderating the Q&A portion of the webinar. As we go along, please submit any questions that you might have for the panelists through the Q&A platform. And don't forget to upvote any submitted questions that you would also like to see answered. With that, please join me in welcoming Renee Callahan.
Thank you, Stephanie. I just want to make sure that folks can see my screen.
We can.
Okay, awesome. Hello, and thank everyone for joining today's session. As Stephanie said, my name is Renee Callahan. I'm the Director of ARC Solutions, and I'm joining you today from Bozeman, Montana. For those who are not familiar with ARC, we are a not-for-profit network whose mission is to foster innovation in the placement, construction, and design of wildlife crossing structures, and to raise awareness about the proven success of crossings in reducing wildlife vehicle collisions. If you'd like to learn more about our work, please feel free to reach out to me directly after today's session. So today I'm going to walk through some of the wildlife-related funding opportunities arising out of the new transportation law that passed last fall. And in particular, I'm going to provide a high-level overview of several new and expanded funding eligibilities for wildlife infrastructure, with a focus on national competitive grant programs. As Stephanie said, my co-presenters, Tony and Chris, are then going to do a deeper dive on some of the state funding programs. As you will hear Typically, the national competitive grant programs start with the issuance of a notice of funding opportunity, or a NOFO for short. And that usually sets the sideboards for a lot of the basic questions in terms of, who's eligible, which projects are eligible, and that's usually released along with a variety of other program-specific information, such as frequently asked questions, scheduled webinars, etc. So as I'm walking through some of these programs, I'll also update you to the extent that we have any information with respect to the timing of those notices. So the first program I want to highlight, which has been getting a lot of attention, is the Standalone Wildlife Crossing Pilot Program. This program created for the first time ever a 5-year, $350 million program for projects aimed at reducing wildlife vehicle collisions while improving habitat connectivity. I've identified the eligible applicants, which are set forth in the statute here on the slide, and also additional selection criteria, including, among other things, innovative design elements, leveraging non-federal funding sources, supporting local economies, and improved visitation, outreach and education, research, etc. So I know there's been a lot of questions about when this program will be launched. We have been hearing informally that this probably won't happen until the next federal fiscal year 23. Of course, that could change, but just so folks know, that's the general timing that we're hearing at this time. If I had to leave you with one bumper sticker for this program, it's that the funding is dedicated. So unlike a lot of the other funding programs, especially those at the state level, crossings are not going to be competing with potholes or pavement for funding under this program. The new law also expands eligibilities under several other new and existing programs, including this one, the Nationally Significant Freight and Highway Program, which is known as INFRA for short. Wildlife crossings are newly eligible under this program. Notice of funding opportunity that included a common application for INFRA plus the next program I'm going to talk about was actually issued in March of this year and closed last month on May 23rd. The new law also includes a new funding program for rural surface transportation grants. This is another national competitive grant program. The focus is on projects to improve the quality of life in rural communities and includes wildlife infrastructure as an eligible project. As I mentioned, this program used the same common application as the INFRA program. And even though that funding notice is closed, if you're interested in learning more about this program or INFRA, it would be worth your while to take a look at the notices from this year in preparation for the next year's funding notice. The law also includes a new program to encourage investment in bridges. And I want to be clear, the focus of this program is on repairing bridges that are in poor or nearly poor condition. But at the same time, up to 5% of the available funding may be used to replace or rehabilitate culverts with the express goal of improving aquatic habitat connectivity and resiliency to funding. USDOT anticipates that they will issue a notice of funding for this program later this month. The next program I want to flag is the National Culvert Removal, Replacement, and Restoration Grant Program. This program focuses on restoring safe passage, in particular for anadromous fish. USDOT expects to issue a notice of funding opportunity for this program later this summer. This next program is actually an existing program known as the Federal Lands Transportation Program. For those of you who are already familiar with this program, you'll know that wildlife infrastructure was already eligible prior to the new law. But what you may not know is that there used to be an annual $10 million cap on how much federal managers could spend on mitigation measures aimed at reducing wildlife vehicle collisions. The new law doubled that cap to $20 million per year. The new law also included this $10 million grant program that was aimed at benefiting pollinators along roadsides and highway rights-of-way. Unfortunately, this program was not funded for the current fiscal year, but I wanted to flag it in hopes that it will be funded in the future, just so folks will be aware that it was included in the law, despite not being funded for fiscal year 22. I also want to mention this new hybrid formula grant program. It's known as the PROTECT program. Again, I want to be clear, wildlife crossing structures are not directly eligible for funding under this program, but PROTECT does provide funding for a new type of improvement that is known as a protective feature. Protective features include projects to upsize culverts or raise or lengthen bridges. And so it's certainly, I think there are potentially some opportunities to improve habitat connectivity at a minimum for aquatic species and possibly also for terrestrial species as part of some of these projects that are primarily aimed at improving infrastructure resiliency. So all the programs I've covered so far have been employing a competitive grant process at the national level. I want to just shift gears for a moment to flag this program, the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program. Bill expanded this program's eligibility to include wildlife infrastructure. This is one of the programs that my colleague Tony is going to cover in more depth in just a moment. So, before I wrap up, I want to give a quick nod to several of the existing funding programs that were under the prior federal law. For folks who follow this, of course, it's the Fixing America's Surface Transportation Act, or it's known as the FAST Act for short. And these are programs that before the new law, you could have used funding from these programs to pay for wildlife mitigation measures. On the state federal side, you're going to hear more about these from both Tony and Chris. So if you look at those programs on the right side of this slide, if you look at the programs on the left side, the national grant side, you'll see that 3 of those 4 programs, the Nationally Significant Federal Lands and Tribal Projects Program, Federal Lands Transportation Program, which I just talked about, that had that $10 million cap that got doubled to $20 million, and then the Tribal Transportation Program Safety Fund are focused on federal and tribal lands. I do want to let folks know that a notice of funding opportunity for up to $23 million for fiscal year 22 in the Tribal Transportation Program Safety Funds program was just released 2 days ago. A heads up that applications are due on September 15th. There is a webinar scheduled next week on the 15th to learn, June 15th, not September 15th, of course, but June 15th to learn more about this program. And then also on that Nationally Significant Federal Lands and Tribal Projects program, USDOT has also indicated that they expect to release a notice on that program later this month in June. Again, although today's focus is on funding, I wanted to make sure that folks know that the new law also includes a number of exciting policy-related elements. So there's going to be some forthcoming guidance and work on standardizing wildlife vehicle collision crash and carcass data, on developing joint statewide transportation and wildlife action plans, and also consideration of connectivity during bridge and tunnel inspections. So while, as Stephanie mentioned, funding is of course critical, I'd urge you to also keep an ear out for additional information on these new policy elements. So in getting down to just the last couple items here, but before I leave you, I wanted to point out 2 resources that folks may find helpful. The first is this snapshot of funding opportunities for wildlife infrastructure. It's featured on the rotating carousel at the top of ARC's homepage. That's arc-solutions.org. This guide, I want folks to know it's a living document. So that means it's being updated as new funding notices are released. So please be sure to check back periodically, or feel free to email me if you'd like to know when there's been an update to to that snapshot. The latest version, which I uploaded yesterday evening, you'll see it includes a date in the lower right-hand footer. So that will help you figure out if you're looking at the latest version or not. It does include a link to the notice of funding opportunities for that Tribal Transportation Safety Fund program. And I do just want to thank Tony Katie in particular for his help in developing the chart. The second thing I want to flag for folks to take a look at is the Federal Highways website on bill. I've got the URL here. If you search for federal highways and bipartisan infrastructure law, this should be one of the first things that pop up. It is chock full of amazing information on how the law is being implemented, not only for wildlife crossings, but much more broadly. So I would invite you to please check out both of these resources if you'd like to learn more. And this concludes my talk. I'd like to thank you all again for joining today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Renee. And just because it's been raised in the chat, just to let folks know, we are recording this session and we'll be able to distribute it after. So with that, please welcome Tony Katie.
Good morning. I really wanted to thank Renee for that great rundown. And the basis of my slide deck really is capitalizing on that snapshot that Renee talked about. All the information that I'm presenting was basically tiered off of that snapshot. So it's a really excellent tool. And I used it just to provide a frame of reference for folks as I'm going through a few funding programs that I was asked to talk about. There are several funding pools within the Federal Transportation Authorization Bill that go directly to the states, and then those are sub-allocated out for different uses within the departments. So I'm going to focus on the STBG program, or the Surface Treatment Block Grant program, the TAP program, Transportation Alternatives, HSIP, or the Highway Safety Improvement Program, and then lastly, I'll talk about the Federal Lands Access Program, or FLAP. I just want to provide a brief overview of each of the funding programs and then mention ways for stakeholders to engage with the state DOTs about project funding decisions. Each state does manage its own allocations of funding a bit differently, and I'm really only familiar with how Colorado distributes its funding. So my conversation will really be from a Colorado-centric point of view, but other state programs will be very similar to Colorado's, and the conversation is going to be broad enough that it'll be relevant to those who live in other states. In order for this conversation to provide value, I need to give a little bit of context or background on the transportation planning process. So I'll run through a few key definitions for our conversation. So next slide. So transportation planning is a cooperative, performance-driven process by which long and short-range transportation improvement priorities are determined. States, metropolitan planning organizations, and rural transportation planning organizations conduct transportation planning with active involvement from the traveling public, the business community, other community and stakeholder groups, environmental organizations, and one of our biggest stakeholders is freight operators. They travel up and down our highways across the country, and so they play an active role in transportation planning. Transportation planning typically follows the steps illustrated on this slide, and really it's just this long, continual, and cyclical process where we determine what our priorities are and how best to fund those. So a few definitions when we go through the funding opportunities will help us direct where we want to place those calls to. A metropolitan planning organization has authority and responsibility for transportation policy making in metropolitan areas. Federal legislation requires that any urbanized area with a population greater than 50,000 have an MPO. And then the MPOs develop their own transportation improvement plans that the DOT then directly incorporates into its own statewide transportation improvement plan. RTPO, or a Regional Transportation Planning Organization, is a voluntary group of non-MPO area local officials and transportation system operators that the states assemble to assist in the planning process. They help in the non-metro area or the rural areas of the state. And then the RTPOs can have representatives from other state agencies, from private businesses, transportation service providers, economic development practitioners, and the general public. In order to determine spending priorities, the state DOTs conduct transportation planning activities that include the preparation of a long-range transportation plan, and that sets performance measures and targets that look out 20 to 25 years into the future. States are also required to develop a short-range transportation plan, or a STIP, a statewide transportation improvement plan. And that's really the financial commitment to complete projects or activities in the next 4 to 6 year period, depending on the state you're in. And then lastly, the enacting legislation, in this case, the IIJA, mandates that the states must involve the general public and other stakeholder communities as they prepare their performance plans, their long-range transportation plan, and their STIP, or their short-term plan. There's a pretty large gap between the 25-year long-range plan and the short-term 4-year STIP. In Colorado, we've created a 10-year strategic plan that aims at bridging that huge time gap and defines priority projects that would be funded in the next 10 years if revenues stay consistent with what our expectations are. And I believe many other states are moving into this model. It's another opportunity for stakeholders to engage with the DOTs to talk about projects that are on the kind of the next funding horizon outside of that financial commitment within the first 4 years. If they have a project they're interested in funding that maybe is not included on that immediate 4-year STIP. In Colorado, we meet with our MPOs and our RTPOs quarterly to discuss project needs, opportunities, and issues. So we're having this constant communication with them about transportation priorities. And then those groups work really closely with the DOT to develop the short-range plan, that STIP, and the long-range transportation plan. So really, in general, anyone interested in directing the use of federal transportation dollars should be engaging directly with their MPOs and their RTPOs to have conversations around reducing wildlife vehicle collisions on our roadway and improving safety. Next slide. So the first grant or funding program that I wanted to talk about is the STBG, or the Surface Treatment Block Grant Program. It's a formula allocation that goes directly to the states. Renee mentioned IIJA did expand the program to include newly eligible activities, including wildlife collision reduction opportunities. Renee mentioned there's $72 billion available for fiscal years 22 through 26 before a set aside for the TAP, or Transportation Alternatives Program, which we'll talk about in just a second. And that was a big increase. It was a 15.2% increase in funding to that program that goes directly to the states. STBG is one of the most flexible funding sources for the state DOTs. A formula is used by the Federal Highway Administration to apportion funds to each state, and then funds are sub-allocated to different areas in each state based off the population size. It provides tremendous flexibility in terms of improving and enhancing federal aid roads. The ability of the money can be urban or rural, bridge or road, construction or planning. Really, there's little that can't be funded with this program. The match rates are at 80% with only a few exceptions. And the eligible entities that can receive STBG funds are the state DOTs, MPOs, tribes, and local agencies. In general, STBG projects may not be on local roads or minor rural collector roads. Exceptions include off-system bridges, some small safety projects, transportation alternatives, rec trails, and safe routes to school projects, which are all funded to local agencies and tribes out of the STBG apportionment to each state. Eligible activities, again, STBG is very broad, so you can apply it to a number of different project types, but the IIJA does specifically call out wildlife crossing structures. And then under the STBG rules governing applicable uses of funding, this would include planning, design, construction, monitoring, and maintenance of new or retrofit crossing structures, or any other strategy that is aimed at reducing wildlife vehicle collisions. Because STBG is such a flexible funding source, it's typically added to other funding types like the NHPP dollars that each state receives, and then it's used to fund numerous programs within the departments. For example, in Colorado, we fund surface treatment projects, road widening projects, culvert improvement projects with this pool of funding. But we also fund a small set-aside discretionary pool for each region that allows us to work with local stakeholders to prioritize regionally important projects. And really of relevance to this conversation, Federal Highways directs the states to identify projects for funding in consultation with the regional planning organizations and the general public. So interested stakeholders who want to use STBG dollars to reduce wildlife vehicle collisions and improve habitat connectivity really should be engaging directly with their regional transportation planning organizations, their metropolitan planning organizations, and the DOT regional planners to prioritize those mitigation projects and show how they improve on the performance targets that they've set within each state. Next slide. So as Renee mentioned, and I mentioned earlier, the Transportation Alternatives Program is a set aside of each state's STBG funding. It's a competitive application-based program. So really it's a sub-allocated formula grant that is passed through to the local agencies through the state DOTs. It's administered by each state DOT, and it accounts for 10% of the total STBG funding. So for fiscal years 22 through 26, there's $7.2 billion available. Each state's TAP funding is determined by a formula designated within the code, and then TAP is distributed by a secondary formula within each area of the state. In Colorado, we're announcing a call for applications for our TAP program this summer. I believe it's going to be in August, with funding for fiscal years 24 through 26. Other states will have different application timelines, so you'll need to check with your state DOT's planning department for those call for application deadlines. The federal share for TAP is 80%, and eligible entities to receive TAP funds include local governments, regional transportation authorities, transit agencies, natural resource or public land agencies, schools, tribal governments, and any other local or regional governmental entity with responsibility for the oversight of a transportation or recreational trail facility. State DOTs and MPOs are not eligible entities under the code, and therefore they're not eligible to apply for TAP funds, although they can partner with applicants on projects and help deliver those projects for the applicant if they do receive TAP funds. Eligible activities include transportation improvement projects that expand travel choice, strengthen the local economy, improve quality of life, and protect the environment. The environmental mitigation category states that eligible activities include projects that reduce wildlife vehicle mortality or restore and maintain connectivity among terrestrial or aquatic habitats. In Colorado, each regional office works with its MPO and its RTPO to promote and encourage stakeholders to apply for TAP funds. And then each regional office uses a two-step evaluation method to determine if a project qualifies for TAP funds. The first step really is just to determine if the applicant is eligible to receive the funds, if they can come up with that 20% match that's required by the program. And then they look to see if the proposed project fulfills a public need or provides a benefit. And then the secondary assessment includes scoring ranked on TAP criteria. And in the environmental mitigation category, scoring by the Region Selection Committee, which is within the DOT, includes factors like environmental sensitivity, project readiness, and then an integration with other plans like our long-range plan, and that there is documented community support. So anyone interested in TAP Fund should be contacting their local DOT planner to learn about those application deadlines, what the scoring criteria are going to look like, and then any other specific project supporting information that they would like to see with a grant proposal. If you're not an eligible entity, really you should be meeting with those that are, your city, your counties, your tribes, and having conversations with them about proposed projects to see if they'd be willing to support a grant application for that particular project. Next slide. So the next program is the Highway Safety Improvement Program. It's a formula allocation that goes directly to the state DOTs with an available sub-allocation to local agencies. IIJA provides for $15.6 billion in fiscal years 22 through 26, and the matching rate is 90% federal. So it's a great program. HSIP is really one of the core federal aid programs with the purpose of achieving a significant reduction in fatalities and serious injuries on all public roads, including non-state owned roads and roads on tribal lands. To be eligible under the HSIP program, a project generally needs to be consistent with the state's strategic highway safety plan, and it needs to correct or improve a hazardous road location or feature, address a highway safety problem, be identified on the basis of crash experience, crash potential, crash rate, or any other data supported means. So it's really a data-driven program. HSIP is available to both states and other transportation agencies like cities and counties and tribes, like I mentioned. In Colorado, the suballocation of funds to its 5 engineering regions that are dispersed throughout the state is based on the overall regional crash distribution. Federal Highways does not determine the local amounts of HSIP funding, but they do monitor how much funding is programmed to the locals annually. In Colorado, we look at the number of crashes on system versus off system to determine the allocation split between the DOT and the local agencies. And then they have their set aside apportionment. If they choose not to use it in any given fiscal year, the funds then go back to the DOT and we're able to use those in our own program. Highway Safety Improvement Program provides federal funds for infrastructure projects. So they really want to see the money used in construction to apply to a fix on the road, and really to improve highway safety locations where there is a demonstrated potential for crash reduction. So they look at observed crash history and effectiveness of the proposed safety improvements as factors in the criteria for evaluating applications for HSIP funding. So really, if you're not in the state DOT and you're an interested party, you should be working directly with your regional DOT office to analyze the crash rates and crash patterns on roadways that you believe have high wildlife vehicle collisions. And then based off of those numbers, you can determine what the benefit to the cost ratio will be to see if it will compete well against other safety improvement projects across the state and whether you're likely to get HSIP funding, either through the state DOT or the local agency. Next slide. So the last program I'm just going to mention is the Federal Lands Access Program. The IIJA does provide $1.5 billion for fiscal years 22 through 26. And it's a allocation to the state by formula with the standard 80-20 matching rate. Eligible entities include tribes, state DOTs, and local governments, and it includes existing or planned transportation facilities that are or will be owned and operated by that state agency or a local agency. Flat funds may be used for the costs of transportation planning, research, engineering, maintenance, restoration, construction of transportation facilities that are located on or adjacent to or that provide access to federal lands. Applicable activities include parking areas, acquisition of scenic easements and historic sites, bike and ped facilities, and environmental mitigation, including habitat connectivity and wildlife vehicle collision reduction. Funding priorities vary from year to year within the program, but projects will generally be more competitive for funding if they're consistent with a federal land management agency's management plan, if they're consistent with the long-range transportation plan within the state DOT. They look to see if projects can be realistically completed based on the project's scope, schedule, and budget. They want to see projects that improve safety and that the projects provide access to a federal high-use recreational site or a site that is a federal economic generator. So those are all things that you want to talk about in your grant application. Projects are selected for funding within each state by a program decision committee. And by statute, those PDCs are comprised of a representative from the Federal Highway Administration, a representative from the state DOT, and then a representative of any appropriate political subdivision within the state. And in Colorado, we have a county administrator being on the program decision committee. Each PDC needs to coordinate with a federal land management agency that could be impacted by the project before any final programming decisions can be made. So those FLMAs do have a role in the decision-making process. Each PDC for each state solicits for access program proposals. They develop the selection criteria, so it'll be unique within each state. And then they develop a ranking system and evaluation process to screen out applications. Selected projects for award will be done over a multi-year program. So I think the last time Colorado did it, we selected programs for a 3-year block of time. So it's really important for anyone interested in flat funds to be coordinating with their MPO, their RTPO, and their regional planners to figure out when those call for applications are going to come out, and have the application ready and support from a federal land management agency in place before that application deadline happens, because usually there's only a few months to respond to those notice of funding opportunities. And that's it.
Thank you so much, Tony. And don't forget, folks, as we go along, to include any questions you might have in the Q&A function. With that, let's turn it over to Chris Lazar.
There we go. Can you hear me and see my slides okay?
You can. Chris, I think you
Awesome.
might want to switch display settings to presentation display.
Oh, you're seeing the wrong screen?
Yeah.
Does that work?
Perfect. Thank you.
All right, thanks. I'll pick up where Tony left off with a slightly deeper dive into the Transportation Alternatives Program with some overview perspectives, and then a case study of a project that utilized TAP funds to build wildlife crossings in Vermont. Tony pointed out that DOTs aren't eligible to apply for TAP grants. I work for a DOT, so full disclosure here, my professional and volunteer work overlapped on this project. And while I work a lot on habitat connectivity in my day job at VTrans, I served as the volunteer project manager for this project. It was important for me to make sure that there was no perception of conflict of interest with this. And so I had to make sure that my involvement here was transparent and supported by management and our AG's office. Note the long list of partners here. Having a deep bench of committed partners on a project will be extremely helpful in landing a TAP grant. The Transportation Alternatives Program began in 1991 in the Bush 1 administration as the Transportation Enhancement Program to fund a broad array of projects intended to complement and improve existing infrastructure while enhancing the overall transportation experience. States are required to set aside 10% of their surface transportation funds for TAP projects. And they're typically projects like bike and ped paths, safe routes to school, streetscaping type of projects. It's important to note that these TAP funds aren't coming out of the regular the paving and bridge projects. These are specifically set aside for transportation alternatives. It's a reimbursement grant, 80% with 20% match coming from the project sponsors. The big change in TAP, as far as we're concerned on this webinar, is in 1998, Defenders of Wildlife and other conservation partners convinced Congress that reducing wildlife vehicle collisions and providing habitat connectivity would also benefit communities and enhance the transportation experience. And so in 1998, the program included this new category for environmental mitigation. And as Tony said, each state administers the program differently. So applicants need to work directly with the Transportation Alternative Program Administrator in their state. Now, there's language in the IIJA now that NGOs are eligible applicants. And I think a lot of DOTs are sorting that out right now. I talked to our TAP coordinator, and similar to a lot of other changes from IIJA, VTrans is sorting out how to approach that change in process. Environmental mitigation for habitat connectivity is famously underutilized in the transportation alternatives program. And the most important part of those applications are highlighted here. And what an applicant needs to do is really make a crystal clear case for an environmental mitigation project. I think people understand the value of bike ped paths much more easily than they understand wildlife crossing. That's just the way it is. So there may be more of a burden of convincing in terms of these category D projects. So the critical elements of an application here are these three sections, and they're all about data. They're all about making a case that there's a need here, and then making a case that, yes, indeed, there is a solution to the problem we're trying to fix. So moving to our case study, this is our project site. This is the wetland portion of the site known locally as the Heisinger Swamp. It's an incredible wetland complex. It's home to, well, breeding home to a large population of amphibians that breed here in the spring. It's a huge wetland complex with hundreds of fishless vernal pockets. Adjacent to the wetlands is this gorgeous, steep, rocky upland hardwood forest. This is pretty much where our population of amphibians spend much of the year. It's where they overwinter underground, and really most of these salamanders that use these habitats spend most of their time underground. They're known as fossorial salamanders. And then the critical component bisecting the wetlands and the uplands is the Moncton Vergennes Road. It's built at the Toa slope of the hardwood forest and partially in the wetland. By much of the US standards, it's a relatively quiet road with around 2,000 cars a day, but that's kind of a busy rural connector, and it's become a threat to the amphibian populations that call this site home. Important to note that if this was a quiet dirt road, we would not need an infrastructure fix here. We'd lose some amphibians over the course of the migration, but one of the key factors is that there's a lot of traffic here. For just under a mile, this road is the site of a massive spring amphibian migration to the wetlands and then back up into the woods. This site started getting notice, public attention in 1997 when a local biologist started collecting data at this site. He started recording the number of species of animals crossing at the site and the number and species of animals killed under the tires. I got plugged into this program of monitoring when I moved to Moncton in 2005. And this is when we started talking about maybe we should tap into the TAP program to build wildlife crossings. And I knew just enough about it to know it was possible and not enough to know about it, how hard it would be. This is our flagship species here, the spotted salamander. And despite how utterly charming this creature is, in order to justify spending a lot of public and private money on an infrastructure fix, we needed a more compelling argument than charming critter. And the Moncton Road site really rings all the bells that lead to an infrastructure fix. And that boils down to about 3 or 4 factors. Diversity. This site is an extremely diverse site. There's a lot of species found here. Spotted salamanders, blue-spotted Jefferson hybrids, Jefferson four-toed salamanders, incredibly diverse site. There's a lot of common species here, but there are some rare species as well. Also, it's an extremely large population. There's massive migration at this site. It's a really impressive site in the spring. And then once again, the key factor is there's increasing traffic volumes and the population's at risk. With our ad hoc bucket brigades, where we were counting, we were moving amphibians out of the way, but on a busy crossing night, even with a bunch of people out there, upwards of 50% of the animals that we were counting were being killed, which was not sustainable. And the site wasn't conducive to having volunteers. So it was clear that the bucket brigades were not a good solution for this site. And so we started looking at an infrastructure fix. Being a local road, we didn't have a good way of tapping into the regular formula funds. And so we started pursuing the transportation alternative grant. It's important to note we would not have been awarded the federal highway grant or the subsequent U.S. Fish and Wildlife grant without data. That data that Steve Perrin started collecting in 1997 was critical to demonstrate the need at this site. Anecdotal is not enough to secure $400,000 of public and private funds. The key to tapping into the grant, and it still wasn't easy, like any grant, there's more applications than funds. And so if a project checks all of the right boxes, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to get funded. So we had years of data to demonstrate a need. We had the support of Vermont Fish and Wildlife and the Addison County Planning Commission and the town. And yet it took 2 attempts at the application process to get our first grant, which was a $25,000 scoping study. We used that to develop conceptual plans. And then it took another 2 attempts at applying to land the $100,000 TAP grant for construction. And it was quickly followed by U.S. Fish and Wildlife, state wildlife grant. And then the money really started to flow after landing the TAP grant. So we got the money, and which was the really hard part, and groundbreaking started in 2015. Low Bid was a large construction firm, but they had their own concrete plant. And because this was largely a concrete project, they won the low bid. They were wonderful to work with. All of the components were cast offsite and delivered to the site. And that limited the amount of time we had to close the road. Road closure was a big issue for the town because there was no good detour. And so limiting the road closure to like less than a week was critical. The walls, that was another big challenge for design. They're absolutely critical for keeping amphibians off the road and guiding them into the structures. We needed them to be economical and sturdy with minimal maintenance requirements. And so we ultimately came up with utilizing what's called waste concrete. The concrete trucks would pour these waste blocks at the end of a job, and they accumulate at the plant, and we assembled these basically like Lego blocks. It was probably the most expensive portion of our project. Some close-ups of the culverts. They're precast bottomless culverts. Our goal was to minimize, to mimic the natural environment as much as possible. So to have lots of airflow, have some ambient light, and allow for a natural substrate where moisture could wick up. We didn't have enough money to mitigate the whole 0.8 of a mile site. So we located the structures in the areas that overlapped with the data that was collected and where the most animals were crossing and getting killed. So one of the big take-home messages is that these darn things work. We've come a long way in the past few years, even since we started applying for these grants, when the notion of an amphibian crossing was seen as mighty fringe. But we're making a lot of progress. One of our goals is that the work we did here will inspire other utilization of the TAP grant, and we're more than happy to share our plans. This is a photo of one of the first customers through the crossing, and this is a GIF stitched together of time-lapse photos of a busy night. It starts out slow, but when we stitch the time-lapse photos of 1 shot per minute together, we have this sequence of of images of amphibians just cruising through the tunnel. We counted over 2,000 animals, both amphibians and other wildlife over each year. The culvert is now being studied by a UVM student to kind of do a proper analysis on what works and also what can be improved in this design for the subsequent projects down the road. And then lastly, I just wanted to share this quick video of what it's like at the site. I sat there on an early spring night, and there was no amphibians. Like a half hour after sundown, I was swarmed with amphibians. It was literally difficult to get up and move about. I was afraid of stepping on some, but it's pretty amazing. And once again, these things work. So I rushed through that. I hope it wasn't too fast, but I wanted to leave time for questions. And so I thank you, and would love to hear questions for the whole group.
Wonderful. Thank you, Chris, and thank you to all of our panelists today. We have about 9 minutes left for question and answer, and we have a lot of questions coming through as well. So please remember to upvote questions that you would like to hear answered to help us prioritize. And I think we'll just get right into it to maximize our time. So I think starting from the beginning, I think this question can go to any of our panelists, but with all these programs, what is the first step that needs to take place to take advantage of funding, and who needs to take it? Will federal agencies reach out to states, or does the state need to take initiative? And does participation in these different programs have to go through each state's Department of Transportation? Renee, I don't know if you want to start on that, or Tony or Chris, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, thanks. Awesome. Hey, I can do maybe the national grants, and then I'll pass off to Tony or Chris to handle the others. I mean, I think the best thing to do is, of course, for the national ones, it's not associated with the state at all. That is basically being run by USDOT and federal highways. So what I would do is keep an eye out for those notice of funding opportunities. Again, if you check the ARC website, we're going to be updating that chart as those notices become available. I've flagged the one that's currently pending and the 1, 2, 3 that are expected between now and end of summer. And then I would also, you can go on to Federal Highways bill site. And there's a little subscribe button. I would subscribe to that site as well, so that you'll get updates as this information becomes available. And then I'd pass it to Tony or Chris if they would like to add anything on the state side.
Well, just for this TAP grant project, first step was to have data, and then we coordinated with the Transportation Alternatives Program. There was a training that we had to take, and we had to engage with the Addison County Regional Planning Commission. So there were formal steps that are articulated in the TAP guidance.
And then I would just say that, kind of what I tried to convey was really, if you're interested in directing the use of funding that comes to the state DOTs, you should be coordinating with those regional transportation planning organizations and your MPOs. They're open to the public, and that's where project ideas are created, and then they're discussed. And then we look at when the next call for applications or the funding opportunity will be available. And that's where people need to let their concerns be heard and have discussions around prioritizing wildlife vehicle collision reduction projects, just in general within the department, showing that it is a true safety concern, showing that there is public support behind those types of projects, and then looking at all the available different types of funding that could be applied to fix whatever the issue may be, whether it's a salamander crossing or a large ungulate overpass or underpass. So being engaged with the transportation planning process is really, really important. It's somewhat frustrating when we're looking out 25 years for the long range plan, but that's where we develop those performance metrics and targets that we're trying to achieve. And if we're focusing on safety and we're really highlighting the high incidence of wildlife vehicle collisions across the state, certain road segments in particular, the DOT can recognize that being an issue of public concern, and they can start hopefully prioritizing funding to those areas.
Wonderful, thank you. We've gotten some specific questions about funding specific stages or components of a project. So one part of the question is, what funding sources are you aware of that could be utilized for data collection and analysis before projects are considered designed? And then also, what funding opportunities will fund a feasibility study or the design process?
So I can just chime in quickly on some of the national ones, and the answer for the ones that we don't have a NOFO out yet, I don't think we can say for sure without looking specifically, unless the statute specifically says that or not. But I think at least for the ones that the NOFO has come out, both the rural and the infra programs allowed for planning analyses and feasibility studies. I believe that the RAISE grant program, which I flagged very quickly, also allows for some of those planning activities. And obviously this is very specific by, what do you mean exactly by data analysis, et cetera. So again, I would go directly to the sources for those, but those three, and then the Federal Lands Transportation Program and the Tribal Transportation Program Safety Fund, I know that they also allow for those sort of planning and data analyses. And at the end of the day, of course, it's the data that is going to make those projects more competitive ultimately at the implementation stage. So I know at least those 5 are clear in that they support some of those planning activities. And then I'll defer to Tony and Chris on anything on the state side.
So I can think of 2 opportunities. One, when I talked about STVG, I mentioned that we do have a discretionary pool of funding within each region that comes from STVG and NHPP. It's called our Region Priority Pool. And we can use that funding however our stakeholders want us to direct it. There's limited amounts of transportation funding, even though we're talking about this excellent opportunity with the IIJA, there's still a tremendous amount of competition. So those small pots of discretionary dollars still have a lot of proposals seeking for, to look for funding out of those pools, but we can use that for anything that our stakeholders want us to. And if they wanted us to use those RPP dollars to fund a feasibility study or data acquisition at a location to determine if there was an issue, they would go to the planning meetings and work with their cities and their counties and their planning organizations to direct the funds to those sites. And we've done it in the past, and it is a viable option for kind of research and planning type activities. But I did want to point out that Federal Highways does give each state a portion of funding called state planning and research dollars. And it's an excellent underutilized opportunity that the states use for research, but also local agencies, cities, counties, tribes, MPOs can access those funds. They can submit a proposal for a feasibility study or a data collection kind of research study to analyze whether there is a transportation related issue at an area in the state that would impact the state highway system. And in some cases, it could be connectivity corridors that are off the state highway system that could potentially influence infrastructure that we have within the highway itself. And it's an excellent opportunity. We funded several wildlife specific research projects in Colorado out of SPR, state planning and research dollars. And I would say it's an excellent opportunity for the NGOs to work with state departments of transportation to look at opportunities for utilization of those research specific dollars.
I would just second the use of the Federal Highway Administration SPR funds. They're a good source, and they're dedicated for planning and research.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. And then maybe one final question regarding capacity and support. Obviously, preparation of an application of this scale is a huge lift. And a few people have asked whether there's funding support available for preparing proposals for DOTs and other eligible organizations that may not have the internal capacity to do so. And also what funding sources exist for costs incurred by NGOs in advancing projects, et cetera. So Tony and Chris, any strategies or partnerships that helped your agencies in the preparation of applications? And then Renee, any other resources that you know of that may be available?
Our applications were all done on a volunteer basis, so it was pretty challenging. I think that a lot of TAP grants, though, when they go through the Regional Planning Commission, if a town is like fully on board behind it, or a municipality, they can hire a consultant to help with that. And so we see a lot of consultant-led projects coming through relative to TAP.
It's a struggle finding agency staff that have the time and the ability to help prepare grant applications is always tough, because they have other duties that's typically not their job. In Colorado, we formed a group called the Colorado Wildlife and Transportation Alliance, and it's a collection of agency staff, so CDOT, and then Colorado Parks and Wildlife, Division of Natural Resources. Park Solutions is a great member within the CWTA. And we have used that as a method of generating the material to go into grant applications. And then mostly we've used that group to help prepare the background information and help develop data that goes into the grant applications. And then the agency staff, my staff, and I have been submitting those grant applications. But forming groups of stakeholders that can help with data acquisition and just typing up grant proposals is probably what I would suggest is a great way to start. And then I would point out those discretionary pools, the regional priority pool. We have used that to hire a consultant to help us prepare larger grant applications. And the stakeholder groups have directed us, the Department of Transportation, to utilize that fund to help us prepare grants. So there are unique opportunities out there to help fund these types of activities. Under the federal grant programs, it's hard to claim match for money or effort that's already been expended. So that's something to consider as well. If you've spent a lot of time developing the data that is going to be required to go into a grant application, you probably can't use that as match. So timing is always kind of hard, and it's going to be really hard to get reimbursed for previous activities. But it is essential, really, to know whether there's an issue and what the solution to that issue is. So a lot of times it's time and money well spent, because it will hopefully lend to your ability to access those federal grant dollars.
Wonderful, thank you. Unfortunately, I think that's all we have time for. I'll pass it back to Stephanie now for closing remarks.
Thanks, Marta. And thank you again to our panelists today for sharing your expertise, and all who were able to join. In the coming days, just a quick reminder, we'll be sending a recording of all 3 of the webinars to anyone who had registered. And while this concludes our initial set of webinar topics, we'll certainly reach out to you and let you know about any future webinars that may arise. We thank you and really hope that you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.